They laughed when a black woman withdrew $500 until she paid everyone's mortgage in cash. Enjoy the story. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of First National Bank in downtown Chicago, casting long shadows across the marble floor. Dorothy Mae Washington stood at the entrance, her weathered hands clutching a small brown purse that had seen better decades. Her navy coat, though clean and carefully pressed, bore the subtle signs of many winters. Threads pulled here and there, buttons replaced with ones that didn't quite match. At 73, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had weathered every storm life could offer. Yet her deep brown eyes held a spark that time had never dimmed. The bank buzzed with its usual Tuesday morning energy. Young professionals in crisp suits moved with purpose, their smartphones glued to their ears, discussing market trends and investment portfolios. The contrast was stark. Dorothy's modest appearance against the gleaming opulence of marble columns and brass fixtures that spoke of old money and established power. She approached the main counter with measured steps, her worn leather shoes making barely a whisper against the polished floor. The clicking of heels from hurried customers and the rustle of important papers filled the air, but Dorothy moved through it all like a calm presence in a turbulent sea. Her fingers traced the edge of her purse, feeling for the envelope tucked safely inside, an envelope that had waited 47 years for this moment. The morning sun caught the gold nameplate on the teller's desk. Jessica Chen, customer service representative. The young woman, barely 25, with perfectly styled hair and manicured nails, was finishing up with a businessman who counted his cash with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to large sums. Dorothy waited patiently, her hands folded, watching the world move around her with the quiet observation of someone who had learned to see everything while being seen by so few. When her turn came, Dorothy stepped forward and placed her hands gently on the counter. The cool marble felt solid beneath her palms, grounding her for what was to come. She had rehearsed this moment countless times in her small apartment, but now, standing here in the Cathedral of Commerce, where she had once been dismissed as inconsequential, her heart beat with the steady rhythm of purpose finally finding its voice. The teller's eyes flicked up from her computer screen, taking in Dorothy's appearance with the practiced assessment of someone trained to categorize customers by their potential value. The slight pause, the barely perceptible shift in posture, the way her professional smile became just a fraction less warm. Dorothy had seen it all before, in banks and stores and offices across the city. She was used to being underestimated, but today would be different. "Good morning," Dorothy said, her voice carrying the gentle authority of a retired schoolteacher who had commanded respect through patience rather than volume. "I'd like to make a withdrawal, please." The transition from polite efficiency to barely concealed skepticism was swift. Jessica's eyes narrowed slightly as she pulled up the account information, her fingers hesitating over the keyboard as if she expected to find nothing but empty coffers and overdrawn notices. The computer screen reflected in her glasses as she scrolled through what appeared to be a modest checking account, the kind that held Social Security deposits and small pension payments. "Certainly, Mrs. Washington. How much would you like to withdraw today?" Jessica's tone had shifted to that particular brand of condescension reserved for elderly customers who might not understand modern banking, each word carefully enunciated as if Dorothy might not comprehend the complexities of basic financial transactions. Dorothy felt the familiar weight of assumptions settling around her like a heavy cloak. Behind Jessica, she could see other employees beginning to take notice. A security guard who straightened in his chair, a loan officer who glanced over from his desk, other customers who had begun to sense the subtle tension that accompanies moments when worlds are about to collide. $500, please," Dorothy replied calmly, her voice unchanged despite the growing attention. She had learned long ago that dignity was not something that could be granted or taken away by others. It was something you carried within yourself, unshakable as bedrock. Jessica's laugh was small, but unmistakable, a sound that seemed to ripple outward through the immediate vicinity like a stone dropped in still water. She glanced toward her colleague at the next station, a young man whose smirk suggested he was already enjoying the entertainment. The silent communication between them was clear. Another elderly customer reaching beyond her means, another awkward moment to navigate with professional courtesy while privately rolling their eyes. "Let me just verify your account balance," Jessica said, her fingers clicking across the keyboard with unnecessary dramatic flair. The pause that followed stretched like taffy, filled with the ambient sounds of business continuing around them, phones ringing, papers shuffling, the distant hum of conversations about mortgages and investments that seemed to exist in an entirely different universe from Dorothy's quiet request. The balance appeared on the screen, $243. Jessica's expression shifted from skepticism to something approaching pity, mixed with the slight embarrassment of having to deliver disappointing news to someone's grandmother. She cleared her throat, delicately, preparing to navigate this delicate social moment with the grace expected of a professional financial institution. Mrs. Washington, I'm afraid your current balance is $247.83. You don't quite have enough for a $500 withdrawal. The words were delivered with the practiced gentleness of someone who had to dash dreams and expectations as part of their daily routine, each syllable carefully modulated to sound helpful rather than crushing. Dorothy nodded slowly, as if this information was not unexpected, but simply one piece of a larger puzzle she was methodically assembling. Her fingers found the envelope in her purse, its edges soft from years of handling, its contents representing a lifetime of waiting for the right moment. The bank continued its busy hum around them, oblivious to the fact that everything was about to change. But something told Jessica that this wasn't over, and the way Dorothy Mae Washington stood there, not defeated, not embarrassed, but somehow preparing for something, made the young teller wonder if she had missed something important. What could a woman like this possibly have up her sleeve in a place like this? The fluorescent lights overhead seemed to flicker, or perhaps it was just Jessica's imagination, but for a moment, the ordinary Tuesday morning felt like the calm before a storm that nobody saw coming. Around them, the business of banking continued, its relentless pace. A young couple discussed their first mortgage application with an advisor 3 desks away, their voices bright with the hope of homeownership. An elderly gentleman counted bills with the careful attention of someone managing a fixed income. The coffee machine in the corner gurgled to life, filling the air with the rich aroma that would carry everyone through another day of financial transactions and life-changing decisions. Dorothy watched it all with the patient observation of someone who understood that every person in this building had a story, dreams they were chasing, burdens they were carrying, futures they were trying to secure. She had been watching people for 73 years, learning to read the language of hope and desperation that played out in places like this every single day. Today, she would speak that language fluently, behind the polished facade of professional banking. She could sense the machinery of judgment that had been grinding away at people like her for generations. The assumptions, the dismissals, the quiet cruelties that accumulated like dust in the corners of institutions, built by and for those who had never known what it meant to be invisible. But Dorothy had learned something important in her 7 decades. Sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one nobody notices until it's too late to ignore them. The envelope in her purse seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, 47 years of patience distilled into a moment that would change everything. She looked at Jessica, really looked at her, seeing past the skepticism to the young woman who was simply doing her job in a world that had taught her to categorize people by their bank balances and the quality of their clothes. "Miss Chen," Dorothy said quietly, her voice carrying a new weight that made the young teller pause mid-keystroke, "I think there might be another account you need to check." The words hung in the air like a challenge wrapped in velvet, and Jessica found herself leaning forward despite her confusion. There was something in the older woman's eyes now, a certainty that seemed to shift the very atmosphere around them. Other conversations in the bank seemed to quiet slightly, as if the building itself was holding its breath. What account could this elderly woman possibly be referring to? Jessica's training had covered every type of banking situation, every kind of customer request, but this felt different. This felt like standing at the edge of something she didn't understand, with a woman who clearly knew exactly what she was doing. Dorothy Mae Washington had been waiting for this moment for almost half a century, and now in the marble cathedral of Chicago banking, surrounded by the quiet arrogance of institutional power, she was finally ready to collect on a promise that had been gathering interest in the silence of history. The morning sun shifted higher in the sky, casting new shadows across the bank floor. And Jessica Chen found herself about to discover that sometimes the most extraordinary stories hide behind the most ordinary faces. Jessica stared at Dorothy, her professional composure beginning to crack around the edges like paint in the heat. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Washington, but I don't see any other accounts under your name in our system." Her voice carried the strained patience of someone trying to maintain control of a situation that was slipping away from her understanding. Dorothy reached into her purse with deliberate slowness, her movements watched by an increasing number of eyes around the bank. The envelope she withdrew was cream-colored, aged to the consistency of old parchment, with edges that had been handled so many times they felt like silk. Official seals, now faded but still recognizable, marked it as something important, something legal and binding and powerful. "Perhaps," Dorothy said, placing the envelope gently on the marble counter, "you should call your manager." The words were spoken with such quiet authority that Jessica found herself reaching for the phone before she fully realized what she was doing. There was something about the way Dorothy stood there, something about the confidence that radiated from her small frame, that made arguing seem impossible. The envelope sat between them, like a bridge between two different worlds. Around them, the normal rhythm of the bank began to shift. Conversations became whispers. Movements became more careful, more observant. The security guard stood up fully now, not because he sensed danger, but because he sensed importance. Other customers turned subtle glances toward the counter where an elderly black woman was somehow commanding the attention of the entire institution. Manager Robert Sterling approached with the measured stride of a man accustomed to handling difficult situations. At 52, he had navigated every conceivable banking crisis, from bounce checks to fraud attempts to emotional breakdowns over denied loans. His grey suit was immaculate, his silver hair perfectly styled, his expression carefully neutral as he assessed the scene before him. "Mrs. Washington, I'm Robert Sterling, the branch manager. How can I help you today?" His voice carried the practiced warmth of customer service training, but his eyes were already cataloguing details: her clothes, her demeanor, the envelope that seemed to have created this unusual situation. Dorothy looked at him with the same steady gaze she had perfected over decades of dealing with men who held power over her life, school principals who questioned her children's potential, employers who paid her less for the same work, landlords who found reasons to delay repairs. She had learned to see through the professional courtesy to the assumptions underneath. "Mr. Sterling," she said, extending the envelope toward him, "I believe this will explain everything." His fingers hesitated before taking it, some instinct warning him that whatever was inside would change something fundamental about this ordinary Tuesday morning. The paper felt important in his hands, not just old, but significant, like documents that shape destinies rather than simply record transactions. The first line stopped him cold. His eyes widened, then narrowed as he read it again, certain he had misunderstood. But the legal language was clear, the signatures authentic, the seals undeniably official. He looked up at Dorothy, then back, down at the document, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and growing comprehension. This can't be right," he whispered. But even as he said it, he was reaching for his phone to make a call that would verify what his mind was struggling to accept. Dorothy watched him with the patience of someone who had waited 47 years for this moment of recognition. She had stood in grocery stores and been followed by security guards. She had applied for jobs and been told the position was filled. She had walked into banks and been treated like a potential threat to their precious marble and brass. But she had also been married to a man whose quiet genius had built financial empires that most people never even knew existed. The phone call Sterling made was brief, urgent, filled with codes and reference numbers that sent tremors through the administrative machinery of the banking system. Dorothy could see the change happening in real time, the way his posture shifted, the way his voice dropped to a whisper, the way he kept glancing at her as if seeing her for the first time. When he hung up, the silence in their immediate area was complete. Even Jessica had stopped pretending to work on other tasks, her attention focused entirely on the drama unfolding at her station. Other employees had begun to gather at a respectful distance, sensing that something unprecedented was happening. "Mrs. Washington," Sterling said, his voice now carrying a reverence that hadn't been there moments before, "I need to ask you to come with me to a private office. There are some things we need to discuss." Dorothy nodded calmly as if she had expected nothing less. As they walked toward the manager's office, she could feel the weight of every gaze in the building. But this time, the attention felt different. Not the dismissive observation of someone deemed unimportant, but the careful scrutiny reserved for people whose power has just been revealed. The private office was all leather and mahogany, designed to impress and intimidate. In equal measure, Dorothy took the offered chair with the same grace she had shown at the teller window, her hands folded calmly in her lap as Sterling closed the door behind them. "Mrs. Washington," he began, then stopped, clearly struggling with how to proceed. "The document you've shown me, it indicates that you have certain rights regarding this institution that have never been activated." Dorothy smiled for the first time that morning, an expression that contained 47 years of patience finally rewarded. "My husband," she said quietly, "was a very careful man. He believed in preparing for every possibility, especially the ones that seemed impossible." Through the glass walls of the office, she could see the bank continuing its business, but there was a different energy now. Phone calls were being made, computers were being accessed, the machinery of verification and authorization was grinding into motion, preparing to reveal truths that had been hidden in the fine print of history. But even Dorothy Mae Washington, who had waited so long for this moment, couldn't have predicted exactly how much her quiet request for $500 was about to change the lives of everyone in that building and far beyond its walls. The computer screen in Sterling's office flickered to life, revealing numbers that made him lean back in his chair as if physically pushed by their magnitude. Dorothy watched his face cycle through the stages of understanding, disbelief, verification, and finally a kind of awed respect that she had never seen directed toward her in all her 73 years. Outside the office, the bank continued, its rhythm but slower now, more watchful. Every employee seemed to sense that something momentous was unfolding, though none of them could have guessed that the quiet woman in the faded navy coat was about to rewrite the rules of everything. They thought they knew about power, justice, and the weight of history's long memory. The verification process took 37 minutes. 37 minutes during which phone calls crisscrossed between Chicago and New York, between bank executives and legal departments, between computer systems that hadn't been accessed in decades and administrative offices that dealt with the kind of wealth that preferred to remain invisible. Dorothy sat in the leather chair with the same calm patience she had shown at the teller window, watching Sterling's expressions change as each new piece of information confirmed what the faded envelope had declared. She thought about her husband, Marcus, gone now for 15 years, and how he had pressed that envelope into her hands on his deathbed, with instructions that had seemed almost mystical at the time. "When they make you feel small, Dorothy Mae," he had whispered, his voice already thin with approaching death, "when they look at you and see nothing but an old black woman who doesn't matter, that's when you show them this. That's when you remind them that some of us have been building power in the shadows while they were busy looking the other way." Marcus Washington had been a janitor at the financial district for 43 years. Every night, he had emptied trash cans and mopped floors in the offices of men who made million-dollar decisions while barely acknowledging his existence. But Marcus had been listening, learning, and slowly, carefully, investing every spare dollar in a way that would make those same men's jaws drop if they had bothered to notice. More than that, he had been collecting information, not for blackmail or revenge, but for opportunity. He had seen the deals made in whispered conversations, after hours. He had observed the handshakes that sealed partnerships worth more than most people saw in a lifetime, and he had positioned himself, legally and quietly, to benefit from the very system that treated him as invisible. The account that was now appearing on Sterling's screen represented 43 years of patient accumulation. Stock options purchased with cleaning service wages, real estate investments made with lunch money saved over decades, patents filed under shell companies, and most remarkably, minority partnerships in financial institutions that had never bothered to check the identity of their silent investors, including First National Bank of Chicago. "Mrs. Washington," Sterling said finally, his voice hoarse with the weight of revelation, "according to these records, you own 17% of this bank." Dorothy nodded, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. "Marcus always said that the best investments are the ones people don't see coming. He bought those shares slowly, over 30 years, through different holding companies. He said someday they might be useful." The implications crashed over Sterling like a wave. The woman sitting across from him wasn't just a customer, she was effectively his boss, The board meetings she could attend, the decisions she could influence, the questions she could ask about why her bank had been treating customers like her with such casual dismissal. "But why now?" Sterling asked. "Why reveal this today?" Dorothy's expression grew serious, and for the first time, Sterling could see the steel beneath her gentle exterior. "Because this morning, that young woman out there laughed at me. Not with cruelty, maybe, but with assumption. She looked at me and saw exactly what this whole system wants her to see. Someone who doesn't matter. Someone whose $500 is more than she deserves to ask for." She stood up slowly, moving to the window that looked out over the main banking floor. Jessica was still at her station, now fielding questions from curious colleagues about what had happened with the elderly customer. Other employees moved through their routines, processing the financial lives of hundreds of people who came through those doors every day, carrying dreams and fears and hopes that were reduced to numbers on screens. "How many people like me walk through those doors every day, Mr. Sterling? How many get that same look, that same assumption that they don't belong in a place like this?" Dorothy's voice carried the weight of decades of observation. "Marcus and I, we spent our whole lives being underestimated, being treated like we were taking up space that belonged to someone more important." She turned back to face Sterling, and he could see something building in her eyes. Not anger, but determination. The kind of resolve that comes from a lifetime of waiting for the right moment to make things right. "I didn't come here today just to withdraw $500, Mr. Sterling. I came here to make a point. About assumptions, about respect, about who really has power in this world and who just thinks they do." Sterling leaned forward, beginning to understand that this conversation was far from over. "What do you want to do, Mrs. Washington?" Dorothy smiled, and this time it was the smile of someone who had just moved a chess piece that had been in position for 47 years. "I want to pay off some mortgages. Every mortgage held by this bank for families in my neighborhood. Every family that's been struggling to keep their homes, while paying interest to an institution that would barely acknowledge them if they walked through that door." The number that appeared on Sterling's computer screen when he ran the calculation made him dizzy. 43 homes, mortgages totaling just over $18 million. It was an amount that Dorothy's revealed assets could handle easily, but it represented something far more significant than money. It represented a complete reversal of power. A neighborhood that had been systematically undervalued and overlooked was about to be freed from debt by one of its own residents. A woman who had been invisible to the very institution that would now process the largest residential mortgage payoff in the bank's history. Through the office window, Dorothy could see Jessica still at her station, probably telling someone about the strange interaction with the elderly woman who had asked for more money than she had. In a few minutes, that same young woman would be processing transactions that would change 43 families' lives forever. But first, Dorothy had one more stop to make. Have you ever experienced or know someone who has experienced being underestimated because of how they looked or where they came from? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The main banking floor had taken on an electric quality, as if everyone could sense that something unprecedented was happening behind the closed doors of the manager's office. Conversations were conducted in lower tones, glances were more frequent towards Sterling's office, and even the normal sounds of banking, the shuffling of papers, the clicking of keyboards, the electronic beeps of transactions, seemed somehow more significant. Dorothy emerged from the office with Sterling close behind, his face bearing the carefully controlled expression of a man trying to process information that challenged everything he thought he knew about his job, his bank, and the quiet woman who was about to transform both. The cream-colored envelope was no longer in Dorothy's hands. It remained on Sterling's desk, along with additional documents that his legal department was already examining with the intensity of archaeologists, discovering a lost civilization. The walk back to Jessica's station felt different this time. Where before Dorothy had moved through the bank like a ghost barely acknowledged by the bustling world around her, now she moved with the quiet authority of someone whose true position had finally been revealed. Conversations didn't exactly stop as she passed, but they shifted, becoming more aware, more respectful of the space she occupied. Jessica looked up as they approached, her professional smile tinged with confusion and growing concern. The last half hour had been filled with whispered consultations among her colleagues, phone calls to departments she'd never heard of, and a growing sense that her routine Tuesday morning had become something much more complex and potentially consequential. "Miss Chen," Dorothy said, her voice carrying the same gentle authority it had held all morning, but now backed by the knowledge that Jessica could no longer dismiss her as simply another customer making unreasonable requests. "I'd like to make that withdrawal now." Jessica's fingers hovered over her keyboard, but Sterling stepped forward before she could begin typing. "Mrs. Washington will be working with our private banking division for her transactions today, but first, I think she has something she'd like to say." Dorothy looked around the banking floor, taking in the faces of employees and customers who had gradually become aware that something unusual was unfolding. She thought about all the times she had stood in places like this, feeling the weight of assumptions and dismissals, carrying the quiet dignity that had sustained her through decades of being underestimated. "Miss Chen," she said, focusing her attention on the young teller who had laughed at her request just an hour before, "I want you to know that I don't blame you for how you treated me this morning. You were doing what this system taught you to looking at someone like me and seeing exactly what you were trained to see." Jessica's face flushed with embarrassment and growing comprehension. "Mrs. Washington, I'm sorry if I—" Dorothy held up a gentle hand. "No apology necessary, child, but I want you to remember this morning. I want you to remember that every person who walks through that door has a story you don't know, a life you haven't seen, and worth that can't be measured by the balance in their checking account." She turned to address the wider audience that had gathered, employees and customers alike drawn by the unusual scene unfolding at the teller counter. "My husband used to say that the most dangerous assumption in the world is thinking you know someone's value by looking at their shoes. He wore work boots for 43 years while building something that none of the men in expensive suits ever saw coming." The silence in the bank was complete now. Every conversation halted, every phone call paused, as Dorothy Mae Washington commanded the attention of an institution that had never truly seen her before this moment. "Today I'm going to pay off every mortgage this bank holds in my neighborhood. 43 families are going to go to sleep tonight without debt hanging over their heads, without the fear of losing their homes, without the weight of interest. Payments that were designed to keep them struggling forever." The murmur that ran through the crowd was like a wave breaking against shore, surprise, disbelief, and growing amazement as the full scope of what she was announcing began to sink in. Sterling stepped forward with a tablet displaying the legal documents that would make it official, his movements careful and respectful in a way that acknowledged the historic nature of what was happening. "But more than that," Dorothy continued, her voice rising slightly to ensure everyone could hear, "I want every person in this building to remember that wealth isn't just about money. It's about patience, it's about dignity, it's about building something meaningful, while the world is busy looking somewhere else." Jessica had tears in her eyes now, understanding finally dawning about who had been standing in front of her counter all morning. "Mrs. Washington, why are you doing this?" Dorothy smiled, the same knowing expression she had worn when she first placed the envelope on the counter. "Because 47 years ago my husband made me a promise. He said that someday, when the time was right, we would make sure that people like us, people who had been invisible for too long, would have a moment to be seen." She looked around the bank one more time, taking in the faces that would remember this day for the rest of their lives. Today is that day. The processing of 43 mortgage payoffs took the rest of the afternoon. Dorothy sat in the private banking office, reviewing each file, learning the names and stories of families she had known as neighbors, but never fully understood as fellow travelers on the difficult journey toward financial security. Each signature she placed on the documents represented not just the elimination of debt, but the creation of hope. Outside the office windows, news vans had begun to arrive. Social media was buzzing with fragments of the story. An elderly black woman had walked into a bank and paid off millions in neighborhood mortgages. But the full truth was even more remarkable than the rumors suggested, and Dorothy knew that this was only the beginning of a conversation that needed to happen about power, assumptions, and the long memory of justice. As the sun began to set over Chicago, painting the bank's marble floors in golden light, Dorothy Mae Washington prepared to walk out the same doors she had entered that morning. But everything had changed, not just for her, but for everyone who had witnessed the quiet revolution that happens when patience finally meets its moment and the invisible become impossible to ignore. What would happen next would depend on whether the world was ready to learn the lesson she had spent 73 years preparing to teach. The golden hour light streaming through the bank's windows seemed to transform everything it touched, turning the cold marble floors into something warm and alive. Dorothy Mae Washington stood at the main counter one final time, but now the space around her buzzed with a different energy entirely. Employees moved with purpose and reverence. Customers watched with curiosity and growing respect, and the entire atmosphere had shifted from routine business to historic moment. The documents were complete. 43 mortgage payments had been processed, verified, and recorded. Families across the south side of Chicago would return home tonight to find official notices in their mailboxes, notices that would change their lives forever. Children would have college funds instead of house payments. Parents would have breathing room to dream beyond survival. Elderly residents would have security in their final years. But Dorothy's work wasn't finished. "Mr. Sterling," she said, turning to the manager who had spent the last 6 hours learning to see his bank through entirely different eyes, "I have one more request." Sterling approached with the careful attention of someone who had already discovered that Dorothy Mae Washington's requests had a way of reshaping reality. "Of course, Mrs. Washington. What can we do for you?" Dorothy looked toward Jessica's station where the young teller was finishing her shift with a thoughtfulness that hadn't been there that morning. The laughter that had started this entire sequence of events seemed like it had happened in a different lifetime, to different people, in a different world. "I'd like to establish a scholarship fund," Dorothy said, "for young people in this community who want to study finance, banking, or business. People who look like me, who come from neighborhoods like mine, who might otherwise never imagine they could work in a place like this or own it." The amount she specified for the initial funding made Sterling's eyes widen again, though by now he was beginning to understand that Dorothy's resources seemed to have no visible bottom. But more than the money, it was the vision that struck him. She wasn't just paying off debts, she was investing in a future where scenes like this morning's would become impossible. "We'll need a name for the scholarship," Sterling said, pulling out documents that would make the fund official. Dorothy considered for a moment, thinking about her husband's quiet genius, her own patient strength, and all the people like them who had built power in shadows while waiting for their moment in the light. "The Marcus and Dorothy Mae Washington Scholarship for Hidden Potential," she said finally, "for students who need a chance to show what they can do when someone finally sees them." As the paperwork was completed, word of what had happened began to spread beyond the bank's walls. News crews gathered outside, reporters made phone calls, and social media exploded with a story that seemed too extraordinary to be true. But inside the bank, among the people who had witnessed it firsthand, there was no question about its reality. Jessica approached Dorothy as she prepared to leave, her young face showing the kind of transformation that comes from having your worldview fundamentally altered in the span of a single day. "Mrs. Washington," she said quietly, "I wanted to thank you." Dorothy looked at her with the same patient kindness she had shown even when Jessica was laughing at her request. "Thank me for what, child?" "For teaching me something I should have already known. For showing me that every person who walks through that door deserves to be seen, really seen, not just processed." Jessica's voice carried the weight of genuine understanding. "I'll never look at anyone the same way again." Dorothy smiled and placed a gentle hand on Jessica's arm. "That's the only thanks I need. You pass that lesson on to someone else, and then they pass it on. And pretty soon we've changed how this whole system works." As Dorothy walked toward the bank's entrance, every person in the building seemed to pause in their activities to watch her go. But this time, the attention felt different. Not the dismissive observation of someone deemed unimportant, but the respectful acknowledgement reserved for people whose power has just been revealed and used for something greater than themselves. The security guard opened the door for her, with a dignity that hadn't been there that morning. Customers nodded respectfully as she passed. Employees stopped their conversations to watch a woman who had just demonstrated that the quiet ones are often the ones carrying the most powerful truths. Outside, the Chicago evening air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and the city lights were beginning to twinkle in the growing darkness. Dorothy paused on the sidewalk, looking back at the bank one final time. Through the windows, she could see the continued activity, employees staying late to process the unprecedented transactions, customers still arriving for evening banking hours, the machine of commerce continuing its relentless pace. But something fundamental had changed. In the way people moved through that space, in the conversations they had, in the assumptions they made about each other. The ripple effects of this day would spread far beyond the south side of Chicago, far beyond the 43 families whose mortgages had been paid, far beyond even the scholarship fund that would change lives for generations to come. Dorothy began walking home, her small purse tucked securely under her arm, her worn shoes clicking gently on the sidewalk. She moved through the city the same way she had that morning, quietly, modestly, without fanfare or drama. But now she carried something she hadn't possessed 12 hours earlier, the satisfaction of a promise kept, a purpose fulfilled, and a system changed by someone it never saw coming. Behind her, the bank continued its evening operations, but every person inside it now carried the memory of the day. An elderly black woman in a faded coat had walked in asking for $500 and walked out, having transformed their understanding of power, dignity, and the weight of assumptions. The city hummed around her as Dorothy made her way home, but she moved through it all like someone who had just completed the most important work of her life, not because she had revealed her wealth, but because she had used it to remind the poor world that everyone deserves to be seen, respected, and valued for who they truly are. Tomorrow, 43 families would wake up free from debt. Tomorrow, a scholarship fund would begin accepting applications. Tomorrow, the story would spread. Further, inspiring conversations about judgment and assumption and the power that lies hidden in the people we think we know. But tonight, Dorothy Mae Washington walked home through the streets of Chicago, carrying the quiet satisfaction of someone who had waited 73 years for the perfect moment to make her point, and had made it so powerfully that no one who witnessed it would ever forget the lesson she taught simply by being exactly who she had always been, dignified, patient, and far more powerful than anyone had bothered to notice. The morning sun painted new shadows across the marble floors of First National Bank, but the building itself seemed transformed by the events of the previous day. The employees arrived for work, carrying newspapers with headlines about the mortgage angel and the hidden millionaire. Customers entered with a different kind of awareness, looking around as if seeing the space for the first time. Jessica Chen sat at her station, staring at the spot where Dorothy Mae Washington had stood 24 hours earlier. The memory felt both vivid and dreamlike. The quiet dignity of the woman she had initially dismissed, the envelope that changed. Everything, the moment when laughter transformed into awe and then into profound respect. The phone at her station rang constantly, reporters wanting interviews, community leaders asking for details, other banks requesting information about procedures for large-scale mortgage payoffs. But Jessica found herself protecting Dorothy's privacy with the fierce loyalty of someone who had learned an important lesson and intended to honor it. Across the city, 43 families were waking up to a new reality. Mortgage payment books were being put away forever. Children were asking their parents what paid in full meant. Dreams that had been deferred for decades were suddenly, impossibly, within reach. At 68th Street Elementary School, Principal Margaret Holmes was explaining to her staff why they had received a call from a major bank inquiring about setting up a financial literacy program funded by something called the Marcus and Dorothy Mae Washington Scholarship for Hidden Potential. The name Dorothy Mae Washington was familiar. Hadn't she been a substitute teacher here in the 1980s? A quiet woman who had a way with the difficult children, who saw potential in students that others had given up on. Meanwhile, at the Chicago Tribune, reporter David Chen was piecing together a story that seemed to grow more remarkable with each phone call he made. The woman who had walked into First National Bank asking for $500 wasn't just wealthy. She was connected to a financial empire that had been built quietly, methodically, over decades, by people the system had trained everyone to overlook. Marcus Washington's obituary from 15 years earlier mentioned his work as a custodial supervisor, his 43 years of service in the financial district, his survival by his wife Dorothy Mae. What it didn't mention were the patents he had filed, the investments he had made, the partnerships he had quietly entered into while emptying trash cans in boardrooms where million-dollar decisions were made. Dorothy spent that morning in her small apartment on Cottage Grove Avenue, fielding phone calls from news organizations around the country. Each reporter asked the same questions. How long had she known? Why had she waited? What was she planning to do next? Her answers were consistent and characteristically modest. Marcus always said the best time to help people is when they least expect it. Yesterday felt like the right time. She declined television interviews, magazine profiles, and book deals with the same gentle firmness she had shown when refusing special treatment at the bank. But there was one call she accepted, from Jessica Chen. "Mrs. Washington." The young woman's voice was soft, uncertain. "I wanted to ask you something, if that's okay." "Of course, child. What's on your mind?" "That scholarship fund you set up. The application asks for an essay about overcoming assumptions. I was wondering—" Jessica paused, gathering courage. "I was wondering if you'd be willing to read mine. I know I work at the bank, but I'm also a student. Night classes, studying finance, and yesterday you taught me something about assumptions that I think I need to write about." Dorothy smiled, though Jessica couldn't see it through the phone. "I'd be honored to read your essay, Miss Chen. You send it along when you're ready." That afternoon, Dorothy made a walk she had been taking for 15 years to Graceland Cemetery, where Marcus was buried under a simple headstone that gave no hint of the empire he had built or the revolution he had planned. She carried a newspaper with her picture on the front page, and she sat on the bench beside his grave to read the article aloud. "Local woman pays off neighborhood mortgages," she read. "Dorothy Mae Washington, 73, of Chicago's South Side, surprised employees and customers at First National Bank yesterday when she paid off 43 mortgages, totaling over $18 million. She paused, looking at the headstone. "They got the important parts right, Marcus, though they're still trying to figure out how we did it." The wind rustled through the cemetery trees, and Dorothy could almost hear Marcus's laugh, the quiet chuckle he used to give when people underestimated them, when they were invited to parties where they served drinks and cleaned up afterward, when they were asked to wait in different areas or use different entrances. 47 years, just like you said," she continued. 47 years of people looking right through us, and then one morning when a young woman laughed at the wrong person at exactly the right time. She folded the newspaper carefully. "I think you would have liked how it happened, Marcus. Quiet, dignified, but impossible to ignore." As the sun set over Chicago, Dorothy Mae Washington walked home through neighborhoods that were buzzing with conversation about what had happened at the bank. Children played games about being secret millionaires. Adults discussed what they would do if they suddenly found their mortgages paid off. Elderly residents shared stories about times they had been underestimated, dismissed, or overlooked. But the most important conversations were happening in living rooms and around dinner tables, where families were talking about assumptions, about respect, about the way people treat each other based on appearances and preconceptions. Jessica Chen was writing her scholarship essay at her kitchen table. 43 families were making plans for futures, suddenly freed from debt, and throughout the city, people were looking at their neighbors, their co-workers, their fellow citizens, with eyes newly opened to the possibility that everyone around them might be carrying stories they had never bothered to notice. The revolution Dorothy Mae Washington had started wasn't about money, though money had been the tool. It wasn't about revenge, though justice had certainly been served. It was about something simpler and more profound, the radical act of seeing people for who they truly are, rather than who the system teaches us to expect them to be. As she climbed the stairs to her apartment, Dorothy could hear her phone ringing again, probably another reporter, another interview request, another attempt to turn her quiet moment of justice into something loud and commercial. She let it ring. She had said what needed to be said, done what needed to be done. Tomorrow the scholarship applications would begin arriving. Tomorrow the 43 families would start making new plans for their lives. Tomorrow Jessica Chen and thousands of other people would carry the lesson forward, treating each person they encountered with the dignity and respect that everyone deserves. But tonight, Dorothy Mae Washington sat in her small apartment, looking, had a photograph of Marcus in his work clothes, and felt the deep satisfaction that comes from keeping a promise 47 years in the making. The evening news led with her story, but Dorothy had already turned off the television. She didn't need to see herself on screen to know that she had accomplished something important. She could feel it in the changed energy of her neighborhood, in the respectful tone of the reporter's questions, in the way Jessica Chen's voice had sounded when she called. She had reminded the world that power comes in many forms, that dignity cannot be purchased or taken away, and that sometimes the most profound revolutions happen quietly, carried out by people who have been waiting patiently for their moment to show the world what they're really made of. Outside her window, Chicago hummed with the energy of 8 million people living their lives, making their assumptions, carrying their own hidden stories and secret strengths. Dorothy had given them all a gift, not just the families whose mortgages she had paid, but everyone who heard the story and reconsidered their own judgments about the people around them. As she prepared for bed, Dorothy Mae Washington smiled one more time at Marcus's photograph. "Mission accomplished, sweetheart," she whispered. "I think they're finally starting to see us." The quiet storm she had unleashed would continue to ripple outward, changing hearts and minds and systems one person at a time. And tomorrow, somewhere in Chicago, another person who had been invisible would find their moment to be seen, to be heard, to be valued for exactly who they had always been. Because Dorothy Mae Washington had reminded them all that kindness has no account limit, dignity needs no verification, and the most powerful revolutions are often carried out by people who simply refuse to let the world make them feel small. Sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one no one notices, until they decide it's time to be seen. Dorothy Mae Washington reminded us that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in dignity, patience, and the courage to stand up for what's right when the moment finally arrives. Her story teaches us that everyone deserves respect, regardless of appearance or circumstance, and that lasting change often comes from those who have been waiting quietly for their turn to make the world a little more just. You are amazing. If you genuinely enjoyed this story, please leave a like and subscribe. It's a great feedback for me. If it made you feel seen, heard, or simply reminded you that change is still possible, share it with someone who needs a little hope today. See you.